Hey, Steve, how's it going?
Doing well, Shailesh. How about you? And thanks for the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. Doing great here. Steve, thanks so much for taking the time. We'd love to discuss all things trade compliance on this one. And let's start with your career. You've had an illustrious career, long and successful one, especially spent a lot of time at your current company. Just walk us through how that has been, and along the way, also share some tips for some of our younger folks in the audience who are maybe just getting started or are 5, 10 years into their career. How do they build a long and successful career in trade compliance?
Yeah, I kind of entered trade compliance probably in a non traditional way. I went to college, university to study chemistry. And so my first job outside of school was in the laboratory. I tested motor oil, and it's my first job. And then I worked in technical service for a motor oil company. And I got recruited into trade compliance with the company I work for now, Bayer. It's a life science multinational company, and they were looking for someone with a science background to do tariff classification and export control classification. And so that was kind of my entrance into the field. That was about 28 years ago, February of 1999. So I've been with the same company and more or less had a vertical career path. A lot of that was good circumstances, good fortune, and blessing along the way. Not so much anything special I did. I mean, of course, I tried to work hard and do my best, but just being in the right place at the right time and taking advantage of those opportunities, things like duty and tariff avoidance, especially, I mean, now more than ever in the present environment. But even when I first started, that was always a big thing, looking for ways to add value for the company. And that international trade was such a big component of a multinational's business that, with just a little bit of effort, you could make a huge contribution and a significant value for the company. And over the years, that's led to my development. And yeah, I give the example of tariffs, but that's also played out over the years in economic sanctions, doing business in sensitive and tricky countries that maybe if you didn't have the expertise, you couldn't, and export controls as well, being able to navigate the complexity of getting licenses. Maybe a good example, with all of the requirements to do business in Russia nowadays and to be able to maintain your license to operate and still supply products. And in our case, we're dealing with humanitarian products. So it's really about making sure patients have access to medicines and medical devices and making sure people have good and plenty of food to eat. And so, there's a good cause behind that. And also, again, adding value contribution from a trade perspective. So, yeah.
Awesome. Steve, if I divide a career into, say, 3 phases, you have the early phase where you're learning the ropes of trade compliance and maybe you're an individual contributor. There's perhaps a middle phase where you're starting to lead a team, a small team of, say, classifiers and other export control folks, and you've started to work more with the other teams. And then you have, say, the later phase where you've grown and you have a larger team. You have a much better perspective of how the business works and where trade compliance comes into play from a business standpoint. For a person who's in each of those phases, maybe the first two, where you're an IC or an individual contributor, and then you move on to become a lead, maybe talk us through what that person should do who's at the early stages in order to move in and grow. And then also for the person who's in that middle stage to then move on to a leadership role.
Yeah, I guess in the initial phase, say a new career path, individual contributor. I mean, I think one that's about learning as much as you can and broadening your experience. Some of that's an openness to taking on projects. Maybe it's doing roles that aren't just what's in your position description, so you're learning more. I think a certain level of external professional development, like in the United States, a big provision is the licensed customs broker. It's kind of an industry standard. It's a government accreditation and it's customs specific, but it is one of the main or primary standards for trade compliance, at least in the US. And there's others, but to be able to pursue something like that gives you a broad depth of learning, but also an external standard that you're benchmarked against. And then I would say taking advantage of opportunities in the external environment through, what I did when I was young was really participate in trade associations, industry associations, and there's some out there for the trade compliance professional. And then you can meet your peers. You're working on kind of collectively what are the hot topics of the day, and you're benchmarking and hearing best practices and then contributing in an industry wide effort. And so probably the combination of those three things really were formational for me. In kind of the middle stage, you probably have to be a little bit more internally focused then once you reach a certain level that you're really demonstrating the value for your company, maybe emphasizing that more over the external things. If you've already achieved those and you already have an external network, that's really, how do you reach the opportunity within your company to have time with top management, that they see your work, they appreciate it, that you're giving them guidance, even in small ways. Maybe you're making presentations to groups of more senior managers on hot topics on trade, on what are the companies doing to mitigate risks or add value, and getting in front of them as a demonstration. I mentioned my time here at Bayer. One of probably those middle things was when I started, we didn't have a formal trade compliance group. This was nearly 30 years ago, so it wasn't uncommon. Like, it wasn't such a high role as it is today. The risks were lower and the enforcement environment was lower, and it was more an operational and, kind of supply chain role. And so I had the opportunity to speak into the formation, the creation of it, Bayer's first trade compliance program and organization, and putting dedicated staff to that. And so, that was probably that middle opportunity, like being able to talk to, vice presidents and above about the need for this organization, the importance, kind of what the benchmarking externally was, and, why it was so critical that it was time for the company to consider and do that. And then, I was able to be staffed into that organization as manager at the time. So, yeah.
That's great. I think those are some great tips. Again, it's a combination of the point in time that you're at, what the organization needs, and how can you really contribute in order to put yourself out there. One aspect that I think is not spoken much about is how does the trade compliance tie itself directly into the company's P&L? Because a lot of times compliance teams are perhaps perceived as, okay, we need to check these boxes and we need to take these approvals from this team in order to move forward. But perhaps people don't realize that there's a definite financial impact of doing trade compliance well. So as a leader now of the trade compliance group, what kind of conversations do you need to have with the CFO, for example, when you need to have additional budget requests, or when you need to really show the value that trade compliance team is having on the company's numbers?
We definitely try to tie it to the impact and the value contribution. I mean, in the recent year, in the past year, or since January 20th, 2025, that value contribution's been a bit easier because the tariffs have been so much in the forefront, and the mitigation of tariffs has been the hottest topic, or one of the hottest topics in the geopolitical landscape. So, your ability to kind of mitigate that and bring calm to the organization that, all these threats or even actual imposition of tariffs, we're still going to be okay. We know how to navigate it. We know how to, mitigate it to the lowest compliant possible level. And yes, we might see incremental costs, but we're going to do this better and faster and more efficiently than our competitors. So we're in a good position. And so that's definitely been, in the last year plus, that's an easy one. Early in my career, one of the biggest metrics or KPIs that I looked at was the external legal spend. Before the company had a function, it kind of by default, if it had a trade compliance, a customs question, an export control question, they had to call external counsel because they didn't have any expertise. And, so the cost of external counsel is significant. And so very quickly I could make the business case that our internal resources were more than paying for themselves by avoidance or minimization of external counsel. At Bayer, our approach is very much to be able to efficiently justify costs and move forward without a lot of bureaucracy. That's a relatively new development and how we run the company, but it's worked pretty well. So, for example, we have a situation where a new country now needs a licensing requirement that maybe in the past it didn't for whatever circumstance. And it's a significant amount of workload, but not getting the licenses mean we would have to vacate the market. And so in short order, you can present the case. We need these resources, XYZ, to maintain the business continuity and license to operate in this country. Obvious decision. Business says we want to stay in that country, want to stay in that market. We support you. You need X, whatever, headcount, resources. Please go do it. And so, that's something that's working pretty smooth and efficiently nowadays. But similar like tariffs, so you could have market access. You need license to operate in this country now in the geopolitic environment. We never know which country will be on the list and which country will come off the list. And so just to be able to communicate that to your top management, navigate it quickly and be flexible and adaptable to the changing environment.
Awesome. No, those are some great examples. I think even companies today who are up and coming may not have a dedicated trade compliance unit. Looking at that external legal cost, I think, is a great way to put it. Those numbers really will tell you the difference, I suppose. You have also done a lot of work around customs and customs modernization, right? Maybe it was an external thing that you did or at Bayer. But talk a bit about that. And I also want to touch upon AI because that's something that y'all are using quite a lot internally today. What were the experiments that you did? What did you learn from that? And how do you see the future of so-called paperless or formless trade?
Well, maybe one of the bigger opportunities or things you might have seen in my profile, I'm part of an organization called BACM, or the Business Alliance for Customs Modernization. So that was probably founded, way, I don't know, a couple decades ago. And it was at the time that the U.S. customs system called ACE was coming about. And so really about, modernizing the customs entry process and, having kind of a fully electronic and seamless process. And so that organization was really advocacy in that area until today. It has, of course, adapted over time. Some of the ideas initially would be like, that a country's export declaration could be, almost in large measure the importing country's import declaration, like that the data was already there. So then you could not have to file separately. You would kind of seamlessly have this, cross-border declaration to declaration. Obviously, that doesn't totally work yet. And, it's very hard to tell where that all is going. I would say, even using U.S. customs as a measuring stick, the level of automation and efficiency and facilitation is probably nowhere near the dreams of the private sector. So that's a reality you have to deal with. That it's slow and incremental progress. And even nowadays, we're hearing much more of a tenor of enforcement versus facilitation. I was in a conference last week and really CBP, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, was explaining kind of, they used to try to say that they would hold those things in, balance, enforcement with facilitation, and the good compliant importers would receive certain benefits and facilitation, for being good stewards. But now their approach is saying that having high enforcement is in fact bringing facilitation because we can focus our attention to the bad actors and, the ones trying to evade tariffs or, falsify their entries to save money or whatever. And that level of enforcement then brings a level of facilitation for the good actors. And so without actually providing additional or tangible benefits to the private sector. So yeah, it's a slow walk. But the advocacy, I would say, for a trade compliance professional, kind of mixing the two discussions, being part of advocacy for the industry and for the profession is good and beneficial for your career development as well.
Yeah.
And for your company, that if you get even a small win in some trade facilitation measure or something that makes your customs process quicker, more efficient, maybe a little less costly, then you're adding again value for your company.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there a country that you look up to, saying that okay, this country has really gone far ahead in terms of digitization of customs or any other processes?
I would probably say the U.S. is leading in that. Even with what I just said, that the U.S. has gone slow, is probably in my experience, still one of the leading countries in that area.
Okay.
Others are trying and getting there.
Mm-mm.
Probably the EU is pretty similar.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. I was also reading, and it's a pretty small country in that sense, but Singapore is quite advanced in terms of its But of course, the scale is very different when it
Sure.
comes to the
Yeah.
US and you.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, mhm.
Yeah, yeah. Also, from an AI standpoint, now over the last couple of years, we've seen AI impact every part of the world, whether it's engineering, whether it's coding, whether it's marketing and sales, and also compliance and trade compliance. You did tell me that you guys are experimenting a lot internally in order to help the human with the AI. Anything that you can share which could be helpful for other companies to experiment with and start adopting?
I think it's just that, we're in our company, because we're, an innovative and science based company, all employees are highly encouraged to experiment with their AI. And I mean, it's probably starting in the science area and, being able to help patients or help make crops in agriculture better, quicker. But then in, administrative and corporate functions, that's a pull through. So we're exploring all avenues with that in our trade compliance. I can't say we have arrived, but like, what are the use cases? Probably the one you hear the most talked about is classification, and really just starting to get into that and seeing, pretty good results. You can't say it's without potential for error. So, kind of one of the reassuring messages we continue to hear is that there will always be this human in the loop, so that, if you have AI, it's a tool to make you more efficient, and perhaps quality is improved, consistency is improved. But at the end of the day, you won't have much defense to say we relied on AI if you have errors. If you
Yeah.
have some hallucination that caused a systemic problem and you messed up tons of customs entries, you can't just say, oh, the AI said it was right. So you do have to have processes and human validation there. So that's part of the trick that we're learning. I would say, also looking at what the costs will be, kind of now it's like everything is free, or, the cost of AI is not so transparent. And so what will that cost be? And maybe it's something that it's a ramp up at first, but then it comes back down after the market stabilizes. But with some of the big AI companies going public, you might see this cost ramping up. Like, this won't be free for so long, and then the market will stabilize, more players will come in, less sophisticated things will cost way less. And so really trying to find that, also the sweet spots, like what areas do you leverage AI, free trade agreements, maybe first sale analysis, country of origin determination, where all can you leverage it? And then what's the right level of human in the loop? What's the human intervention? What's the human governance? And then I think also looking to the external environment. What do the customs authorities accept? What would they consider to be reasonable care? What would they consider to not be negligent in the use of these tools? So yeah, it's an exciting time, and yeah, for what I would recommend to the other professionals is get into the space, explore the space, experiment.
Mm.
I don't think it's going away. So, be an early adopter.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's great. I think having that curiosity is certainly important because we're seeing that impact every aspect of our life, not just personal, across like various professions as well. One of the trickier aspects, I suppose, of any classifiers or trade compliance professional's role is tariff language is very different than what we use regularly, right? Like, call it marketing language or product language. So how do you coach someone who's new to this in terms of, okay, how do you really understand the tariff language in a way that's much easier to follow? Because that at least I have found it to be very tricky. For example, a computer is not a computer, it's a data processing unit, right? So there must be so many different such examples, and especially when it comes to the sciences, there's probably a lot more. So what was your trick to kind of understand that and have like a mapping of, okay, this means this?
Yeah, probably the basic lesson, like, that the tariff itself is legally binding. So you have to look at those general rules of interpretation, the chapter notes, the section notes, and treat that as law, like it's legally binding, because it's so easy to look at the tariff schedule and sign, a breakout that's in the 8 or 10 digit and say, oh, that's the answer. But one of the first tariff rules is you start at the heading and have to work your way down. And if it doesn't fit the heading description, you don't get to go to the, statistical level. You can't just jump 6 levels and say it's the answer. So I think that is, for your classification experts, that's foundational to never forget that. Like, start with that and never forget it. So, because it's easy to default, oh, this must be the answer, but you have to follow these rules. So I think also then, using the tools you have for what's the nature of your portfolio. So as you mentioned, like we're science based, so we're shipping a lot of chemical and biological materials. So in our classification processes, when we have a new material that has to be shipped internationally, then our workflow asks the person that's requesting the classification to really focus on the scientific and technical information, not on the marketing information. So we have certain questions and sets of information to classify chemical and biological materials that are like required fields. So you have to tell us what this. You can't give us your marketing bulletin. We really need technical information, chemical composition, and things of that nature. So that helps drive getting good results. Is asking for good information to start. And then, you have things that aren't core to your portfolio, but you still have to ship them from time to time. So a lot of times those are ones, we didn't make at Bayer. We bought it from another party. So it often, for me in that case, if you can get it, the easiest thing is to go to the company that made it. It doesn't always work because sometimes there's small players and they don't even know what that means, or they're maybe not willing to tell you. But that's, when you're dealing with some, kind of hardware or something very technical piece of equipment that you had nothing to do, nobody in your company can give you those technical details. That's helpful. And yeah, I think we spoke earlier about like the fact, and I mentioned in my introduction, we also staff our classification experts with science backgrounds. So that helps with the translation piece.
Yeah.
I think I was one of the guinea pigs there, and Bear said would be easier to train a scientist to do classification than to train, a logistics person to do science.
Yeah.
So let's start with that approach. And that's worked well for us.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I especially like the point of getting rich information. Otherwise, you don't have enough to like go down the right paths, right? And incomplete information will usually lead to an incorrect classification. So that's super important. And I feel a lot of teams do struggle with getting that information because they don't know whom to reach out to, or they get incomplete information. So that takes like multiple rounds of feedback.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. And just to round things up, Steve, I asked this question. What's a trade story that you would share with your grandkids?
Well, I gave that some thought because I knew you were going to ask it. One of them we kind of, so I have 3 points on this. One of them we already mentioned, and that was the fact, I started getting into this profession. I went to school as a chemist. And so it's not really a trade story, but to tell your grandkids, like, you never know actually where you're going to land in your professional development, your career. So important to find something you love doing. And so even though I went to school for chemistry and I started in a laboratory, I've made a career out of this and didn't necessarily relate directly to what I went to school for. So that's something I would try to explain and teach my grandkids. The next one was just kind of a funny thing. Like when my children were growing up, they're adults now, but they would often get asked, what does your dad do? What is my job? And because they couldn't really define it or explain it, they often told their friends I was a spy because, they would overhear me in
Yeah.
conference calls and things talking about sensitive countries or talking about things that are in the media, because so much of what trade is driven by is in the news and on TV. And so, yeah, they just quickly defaulted to say, well, my dad deals with all these countries and he's kind of a spy. So just a good story to tell the grandkids that their grandpa wasn't a spy, maybe. And then the last one, the third piece, and this is just fresh. So I mentioned I have 2 grown kids. My daughter just graduated from university and she's gone into the field of trade compliance. So a lot of what we just discussed is things like,
Wow.
passing on to her. So, just the aspect, like it happens fair amount. Like a child goes into the profession of their parent.
Yeah.
And so, just to have had that opportunity with my daughter and to be able to coach and mentor her along the way, that's just been a great blessing and a really cool thing.
Yeah, that's amazing. And this podcast is called Classified, so the spy story is going to align very well with the name.
Yeah. Yep. 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 Cool.
Awesome. That's a beautiful story. Thank you, Steve, for sharing that, and thank you for taking the time, giving us your knowledge and learned experiences. That's very helpful to the folks who are listening.
Yeah. My pleasure. Thanks for doing this. It was great. Appreciate it.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you.
Cool.